Have you ever looked at a Pokemon and said, why is that Pokemon that type? It's been happening since Gen 1. So we got to wondering, how are these Pokemon that seem so obviously designed to be a certain type affected by the fact that Game Freak saw fit to give them another? We've selected 5 for the task, and we're starting off big, legendary in fact, with Lugia. One of the most universal aspects of the human condition is the experience of encountering Lugia for the first time. Whether in-game in Gens 2 or 4, or in arguably the greatest Pokemon movie, we were all awed by its majesty, its power, its Aeroblast. Call it Martin Scorsese, because that moment in XD Gale of Darkness where it destroys the ship is absolute cinema. Whether you watched it rise from the sea, cloaked by a whirlpool as it prepared to battle Kanto's legendary birds, or whether you took the plunge to find it in the lowest depths of the Whirl Islands, you were thrilled by its aquatic splendor, its oceanic grace, and depending on the version you were playing, you were also buffeted by its Hydro Pump, potentially boosted by its Rain Dance. Eventually you caught it, overjoyed, and went to check it in your party, but something caught your eye, something that sent you into a state of shock and disbelief. You unconsciously expected to glance past the water flying typing that you always knew it had, but something was missing, something was wrong. What in the Ash Ketchum was going on? A psychic type? So apparently the explanation for this is that back in the day, psychics were regarded as the strongest in the game. Gold and Silver came in the aftermath of those original games and the reign of Mewtwo, whose appeal came from its peerless psychic powers. They wanted Lugia to quote-unquote make a stronger impression, and thus it was made psychic, despite everything about its design pointing towards water. It even makes it a more fitting counterpart to the fire-type Ho-Oh. So, like the fall of Constantinople, this affects Lugia James's legacy. Competitively, Lugia was Uber's original Great Wall. In its inaugural generation, it was particularly renowned for being the one counter to the ultimate uncounterable Pokemon, Gen 2 Snorlax. Its defensive profile is stunning, and even the introduction of a Stealth Rock weakness in Gen 4 didn't do much to hinder it, especially once Black and White 2 bestowed the multi-scale ability upon it, launching Lugia to comically, cosmically incomprehensible levels of immortality. But what role did Lugia's psychic typing play in that? Well, very, very little. Its resist to psychic borders on useless, and its quadruple fighting resist, while certainly nice, is redundant for a Pokemon of such titanic bulk. Meanwhile, its dark weakness makes it vulnerable to pursuit, and its ghost weakness would eventually become one of the worst in the game. For how great it is defensively, the tacked-on psychic typing makes Lugia strangely, well, not exactly flawed or lacking, but leaves you wanting as somehow it could be even better. Now imagine if it was half water instead. Yes, it gains a quadruple electric weakness, and thus has to be more careful around the tier's many thunders, but the benefits are absolutely incredible. It loses the dark and ghost weaknesses, which is incredible. Lugia is so bulky that most resisted hits verge on neutral damage for other Pokemon. This is also why its newfound grass neutrality changes just about nothing. It also gains resist to fire and water, which is superb for staving off Uber's very strongest attacks, those boosted by the weather of the primals, and very much including those of the primals themselves. Going half water also means Lugia loses its weakness to another one of the most dangerous offensive types in the game, Ice. It's not just about making Lugia better defensively either. One of Lugia's biggest flaws is that it can lean quite a lot on the passive side, and much of this comes from the fact that Psychic, outside of Gen 7 Ubers, is a useless stab for it. Even the low PP Aeroblast is excellent on Curse sets in Gen 2 and Choice Band sets in Gen 3. Now, it's not going to become a slugger with Water Stab, but it does become a lot more capable of dishing out decent damage with the vastly improved coverage of Stab Surf, especially in Gens 3 to 5 with their permanent rain. Heck, maybe it even receives Scald in Gen 5, which would be extraordinary. Calm Mind Lugia, which it would retain even without being a psychic type just like Ho-Oh, would also become a much better sweeper. Just imagine what could have been though. Funnily enough, this would have allowed Gen 2 Snorlax to threaten Lugia more easily with Thunder or Thunderbolt. Still, every gen after that though, Lugia would be much improved. Even Ubers need buffs sometimes. But now we'll pivot to something about as far from Uber as we are on Earth from Alpha Centauri, with Luxray. But before we go into Luxray, here are earbuds with the right type of audio quality. Our sponsor, Raycon. Raycon is the best and affordable high-quality audio. In fact, I use my Raycons literally every day because I literally can't do chores without listening to something, be it music, a podcast, or an audiobook. And Raycon has gotten even better with their new Essential Open earbuds. These Essential Open earbuds are feather light, as you don't even feel that they're there. Seriously, I can leave them on for hours and I forget they're even on. And they also have a great balance of audio since they are better at letting in your surroundings. For example, you can go for a walk and listen to your favorite podcast, but still be aware of traffic, which is something I often do. They also hold an insane amount of battery with a 36-hour battery time. I don't have to charge these often. How convenient. I really don't know how I'd get through the day without the Raycon Essential Open earbuds. So if you want the best in premium audio and also support the channel to help us produce more content, go to buyraycon.com luxray.com/FSGOpen to get 20% off your order of Essential Open earbuds. Luxray needs a little more flavor to its game. So since not only does it have a rather generic electric-type style once you get past the sweet base attack, and the all-timer ability Intimidate, and of course the attachment you have to it from raising it from a Shinx on your journey throughout Sinnoh, but Luxray also lacks the stats to be impactful in any other department, leaving it a perpetual competitive non-entity. Simply delivering on the suggestion of its design would go a long way. That suggestion being, of course, the Dark type. With the Absol-esque brooding edginess of its design and the late-level learning of Crunch, there is plenty of reason for Luxray to be the first blend of electricity and its darker side, and not Morpeko, though this isn't to disparage the validity of that darkest of experiences, the Hangry Crash Out. Anyway, having two stabs, both of which pack solid super effective and neutral coverage along with the way they complement each other rather than overlap, would do wonders for Luxray. Being able to really threaten ghosts and psychics would be wonderful, as would its ability to spam a stab without fearing a complete blank upon being met with a ground type, while not having to flail around with the pitifully weak coverage of Ice Fang. It would give Luxray the ability to deliver on at least some of the promise of the Choice Band set that it's been begging to be able to run. This especially improves once Gen 6 comes around and removes Steel's Resist the Dark, giving Luxray one of the most spammable moves in the game, and with powerful secondary Electric stab to make any Fairy type coming in think twice. Seeing as Dark is newly spammable in this gen, Luxray's own Dark typing also takes on new value in being able to resist it, and the Dark typing's extra benefits defensively extend to include Psychic Immunity and an absolutely amazing Ghost Resist. You don't have to buff its stats or its move pool, you just have to make Luxray half Dark type, and while you're not going to send it shooting to OU, you make it infinitely better and a real lower tier contender. And all you're doing is delivering on what it should have had to begin with. Plus, this might inspire Game Freak to give it Pursuit and Knockoff, which would be excellent. And speaking of single-type Pokemon whose seemingly obvious dual typing was mysteriously left off, we have Goodra. For a pseudo-legendary Pokemon to be so bland is one of Game Freak's greatest design failures and crimes. But stunningly, with Goodra, they managed to make a milquetoast mannequin of Dragon-type mannerisms. What's particularly strange is that the simple addition to make it much better and more interesting was not only staring them right in the face, but it was giving them two options. In addition to being draconic, Goodra is a slug-like Pokemon, so it's coated with slime. It's literally dripping from its chin and arms. So you can either go the Gastrodon route and give it the partial water typing it's so evocative, and forget Hydro Pump, this thing even learns Muddy Water. It even has Hydration as one of its abilities. Talk about deliberate. Goodra would be able to unleash the wonderful dual stabs of Kingdra with non-Empoleon water resist folding to Dragon and vice versa, but stronger, while throwing in the fire and electric capabilities of Palkia's move pool. It'd make an excellent addition to the Dragon water tradition. Losing the ice weakness would be beautiful, while the quadruple fire and water resist would further bolster the defensive profile that's supposed to be Goodra's major strength over its fellow pseudo-legends. Of course, it'd also be a Dragon type with a secondary stab capable of threatening most Fairy types, which would be fitting for the pseudo-legendary introduced in the same generation as Fairy types. But what if you push that even further? Goodra oozing slime could also be taken as suggested of poison typing. Similarly, Gastrodon also learns Sludge Bomb. So what if you leaned into this further and anticipated Gen 7's Naganadel, instead making Goodra the first Dragon poison typing? Thematically, it would fit into the whole pseudo-legendary that can actually threaten the type introducing to check it thing. Except it goes even further. Not only does Goodra gain super effective stab against them and Fairy neutrality, by becoming poison, it leans into the desire to balance the type chart by improving the lower in standing poison type as was an intent of introducing the Fairy type. Have fun switching your Fairy type in to block Draco Meteor when you immediately have to run from the Sludge Wave afterwards. And as always, non-Heatran Steels that would block both stabs would be terrified of fire coverage, while Goodra also had a few ways it could find around Heatran. Goodra fell to UU in its debut generation, which is a pretty brutal badge of dishonor for a pseudo-legendary, and to make matters worse, it was absolutely terrible in UU. If it had either of those secondary types, it would have been much better. Not the only Pokemon on this list that should have had water typing, and since we're harkening back to Lugia, that brings us to Noctowl. Early game birds are normal flying, right? Yeah, whatever. Number 1, they broke that rule with Talonflame. And number 2, Hoot Hoot and Noctowl are so psychic coded, it's insane. Look at the tools in their arsenal all the way back in Gen 2. Hypnosis, Nightshade, Nightmare, Dream Eater, Confusion. This mix of psychic and ghost moves is pure psychicism. Practically copied over from Hypno's Learn Set and Modus Operandi. In Gen 3, Noctowl full-on leaned psychic. In Gen 4, it learned Magic Coat. In Gen 5, it learned Psycho Shift and Zen Headbutt. In Gen 8, it learned Future Sight. These are all about a million miles away from what you'd find in the move pools of Pidgeot and Staraptor. Oh, Gen 8 also gave it Nasty Plot, which is another sort of cerebral, telekinetic sort of move, nowhere near the earthy, regular bird profiles of Fearow and Swellow. So here we have a sort of inverse Lugia situation. Noctowl is clearly geared to be a Psychic type, and by not being one is significantly worse off. Does Psychic Flying have its shortcomings as a type combination? Of course it does. Is it better than normal flying? By miles. Let's start with how you go from being fighting neutral to quadruple resistant. Trading the ghost immunity in for a weakness is unfortunate, but look at all the other upsides you get. In addition to a psychic resist, which is very useful in the lower tiers, you get actual psychic stab yourself, which for all its faults has far more upside than the complete nothingness of normal. Noctowl still would have been terribly meager for a long time, but over the generations, it actually would have improved and would have found a niche somewhere. In Gen 7, it also gained Hurricane, which would be much more interesting if it had better opportunities to switch in. For example, against the fighting types who were so threatened by Hurricane, especially when joined by Nasty Plot in Gen 8. It briefly was actually too good for PU, but this didn't last once the decks opened up and it returned to untiered again. This Doom Noir fate may have been avoided had Noctowl bore the blessings of the Psychic type, especially because that was also where it got that other defining, powerful tool that was being used to such dominance in OU, Future Sight. Think about this, dual stab Future Sight and Hurricane along with heavy duty boots to ignore Stealth Rock. You know what else used that exact strategy? Galarian Articuno, one of PU's most terrifying Pokemon, and great in NU as well. Okay, Noctowl wouldn't have hacked it in PU in that specific instance because it would have just been a worse Galarian Articuno, but it's beside the point. The point is that it basically should have had the same toolkit, just with lower stats, which makes sense because it's not a legendary. But for some reason, the bird famous for being ice got a variant being psychic after Noctowl was passed up for a psychic type mega that would right this blatant wrong. Galarian Articuno's signature move is even called Freezing Glare, and it's a psychic type move, but Noctowl can't get jack, and that ain't right. Now, before we go into our final selection, we've got some honorable mentions. Groudon and Koraidon famous for setting up sun, yet are not fire type, and I guarantee everyone who played Pokemon Ruby had the Lugia experience. They caught the box legendary and were stunned to discover that it wasn't a fire type. Yes, its name sounds like ground and it rules over the land, but a Pokemon can have two types. This in the generation that also introduced Camerupt. At the very least, Groudon avoids making this list because the Gen 6 remakes gave it a primal form that did indeed make it part fire, as it should have been all along. That said, since then Gen 8 took primals away, and not only did Groudon return to its original mono ground, Game Freak then had the gall to introduce another box legendary Sunsetter that also wasn't a fire type. Except this time it was even worse, because Koraidon does have two types, neither of which is fire. Of course, it can and often does terrestrialize into a fire type, but still. And now our finale with Lucario. The hype around Lucario going into Gen 4 was unreal, given that it was revealed before the games came out, but actually discovering its typing was a source of puzzlement for many. The thing is all about aura, and yet it's very concrete in its fighting steel typing. Of course, this is not to say that those types can't have some sort of mysticism, but for the Pokemon that was all about aura, way before aura farming became something people said without a shred of irony, well, maybe it makes sense, considering the movie it was in was Lucario and the Mystery of Mew, which has also been co-opted by pseudo-scientific looks-maxers and grifters. That said, it seems abundantly clear that Lucario is a psychic type. It, of course, learns both psychic and calm mind. It would seem that Lucario was given half steel typing because at the time, it was completely unique and had yet to exist. Steel is also one of the best types in the game, and indeed, Lucario's typing was lauded. If it were fighting psychic, it would feel like both a repeat of the previous generation's Metachamp and a copy of the Glade that it was introduced in the same generation as. Not quite as unique as the marketing around it would suggest. It's tough to deny it's more fitting though. Certainly far more than Steel. Lucario gaining Meteor Mash several generations after the fact doesn't exactly dispel this. Having said that, being fighting Steel was major for Lucario. It mostly wasn't because of the Steel stab though. In Gens 4 and 5, Stab Bullet Punch made it terrifying after a Swords Dance because the boost let it crush the Gengar, Terrakion, and Scarf Tyranitar that it couldn't beat with its main tool, Extreme Speed. No, the Steel typing was incredible because it made Lucario one of the most Stealth Rock immune Pokemon this side of Magic Guard, and packing immunities to Sandstorm and Toxic to boot. This meant that not only were you not wearing it down passively with your usual tools, it could also run Life Orb with a freedom rarely afforded and barely affected. It also had an amazing list of resists, and while its low bulk meant it was hardly a tank, it did mean that it punished an enormous amount of choice moves for that one Swords Dance that it needed. That said, if it were fighting Psychic, it'd still be good in its own way, like a faster Gallade basically, with Extreme Speed. And the ability to hit on the special side as well, which neither Medicham nor Gallade can do. Specs Lucario would have quite the stab Psychic off of its superior special attack, seeing as no Steel or Dark type will want to switch into it. Mega Lucario would be absolutely ferocious as well. In this instance though, Game Freak going away from the type implied by the design absolutely helped Lucario overall. Getting whittled down by Sandstorm and Toxic, as well as lacking resist to Ice and Dragon, would impede it severely.
And thank you so much to our platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Eric Dissing, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Gameslayer, Nurse Jake, Pretzel SP, Sojiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soares and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu, Wardine for their major support of our videos.